about, things that we're seeing right now. But there are some things that we've been seeing for a while. Kurt, you even touched on it in terms of, 2 years ago, if you wanted to invest in a digital marketing initiative or people with certain types of specialized skills, that would have required probably many meetings and a business case and proving out the ROI, et cetera. But clearly some of the things that we're seeing now, and Jeff, you talked about this, have been coming for some time, right? It's just that it accelerated over the last 18 months. And Jeff, I know you touch on this in your book as well. The impacts of something so monumental as the pandemic and all the far-reaching impacts into the workforce. There's a lot of debate about when this actually started. Did it start with the pandemic, or did it start, years ago?
Well, certainly when we think about the evolution of the workforce, and the reason I called the book The End of Jobs is not because I believe that jobs will collapse. Again, almost uninterrupted trend over the last 200 years, more and more jobs in society. It is because the job as we knew it over the last 30 to 40 years, this one office, one manager, 9-to-5 job, that job is dying. And the death of that job happened well before the pandemic, but the pandemic massively accelerated its death. And its death gets manifested in 3 broad trends. One is remote work. We'll double click on that in a second. The second is on-demand labor. And the third is this general fourth industrial revolution, robots and AI. So on the first, remote work. Remote work had grown 100% from 2010 to 2020, from 1.5% of the labor force to 3% of the labor force. And remote work has a very specific definition. It means more than 50% of the time you're not going into an office. And we can track remote work because it's a tax nexus issue. So our friends at ADP know exactly who's a remote worker because they know where your tax nexus is. Flexible work, we don't really track. Meaning if you go to the office 3 days a week, I don't know who you are because your tax nexus is the office. If you go 2 days a week, I know exactly who you are. So 1.5% to 3% of the labor force. When we look at the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic, 40% of the US workforce was working remotely. Only 42% of the workforce can work remotely, right? That's something that a lot of people don't understand, is that people obviously in manufacturing and transportation and logistics and a lot of retail operations and a host of services can't work remotely. So it's always important to remember that when we talk about our segment of the labor force, we're talking about a subsegment of a subsegment. And the trends of the labor force as a whole are very different. But remote work post-pandemic, all the data and research that we see at the ADP Research Institute and at various other places would tell us about 8% of the US workforce will work remotely. Remembering remote has that very specific definition. And upwards of 33% will work either remote or flexible, where they're going to the office 2-3 times a week or 3 weeks out of the month, and a month they're working from home. That flexible work arrangement will become the byword for the workforce going forward. On-demand labor, people like to think it got invented with Uber. On-demand labor has been around for generations. It has been about 25% of the labor force for a very long time, growing slowly and steadily. There are a lot of predictions out there like, oh my God, 50% of the labor force is going to be on demand by 2028. No, it's ridiculous. When I started Work Market in 2010, the prediction was by 2020, 50% of the labor force will be on demand. Now, look, I took that and I put it into my investment deck because I had to raise $100 million to build Work Market. So I used it, but I knew it was bullshit. Was not true then. It is not true now. That is not going to happen. ADP, using Work Market data and ADP data, was able to show a 3% market share gain from 2010 to 2020. So about 25% to about 28%. That slow and steady growth will continue to be the hallmark. With this one, though, we don't really know how the pandemic's impacted it. For those of us that spend their free time, sadly, studying labor statistics, there's just too much noise in the statistics right now. We don't have a good sense. And on-demand labor, much like flexible work, is very difficult to track. But our general sense is it may have accelerated that trend, but not in any unbelievably great way. So maybe instead of 0.3% a year of market share gain, it might get to 0.4,
right?
Something along those lines. And then robots and AI, this trend of automation and different technologies massively increasing productivity has been around since the first industrial revolution. But what is different this time, and this was certainly a point, Curdy, you brought up with, it used to be, FaceTime is what helped people have productivity, not in a factory, right? In a factory, it was very clear what determined productivity. All of those types of tools are coming to the office, are coming to service industries. And so it will decrease the amount of FaceTime, but it will increase the amount of optics into productivity that people have. And all of those things will layer on top of other things that remove repetitive high volume tasks that continue to remove people from the workforce. But the end of the story is that robots and AI will lead to no net job losses in the economy over the next 20 years. There will be tremendous dips in certain types of employment, but there'll be increases in others. And we will talk a little bit later about reskilling and its importance as a labor force trend.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you touch on something interesting there, Jeff, about, it creating more jobs. And one of the things that we're seeing here, and of course, at Blend, we focus on marketing and product, right? So those are the trends that we tend to pay a lot of attention to, but the specialization within those skills, right? And the analytical skills required that go along with that, are now in much higher demand than 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so it's not that there's fewer jobs, but there's different jobs, right? Different jobs.
Very fair. Very fair. Look, one of the, I wouldn't call it a macro trend, but certainly a micro trend is something we call the atomization of work and breaking things down into their component tasks. It is an inherent part of the death of the 9-to-5, one office, one manager job, moving, by the way, into what we call the fluid, team-based, work from anywhere, always on job. That's kind of the new job in this context. And the atomization of work, and therefore the matching of skills to specific types of work, is certainly a powerful subcurrent there.
Yeah, for sure. I know for a lot of folks, right, they think of those things and they say, oh, my skills, right? I'm worried about my skills and whether I can keep up with these trends as, things are moving, and especially overnight, right? In a very short period of time, whether you were at a very small company or a large global multinational, there was a huge focus on digital transformation, regardless of how many meetings there had been over the last 10 years, right? Suddenly it was the top of the agenda for everyone. And I think that that's having a huge impact on the workforce today as well.